Hello everyone, this is Al Fadi and I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of this series that we have titled The Qibla Controversy. Today we are going to continue to unpack the arguments raised by Dr. David King. Last time we looked at a number of his theories that he used to explain away or defend the fact why early mosques built by early Muslims did not all face Mecca until later. When today we are going to take a look at 6 mosque examples that Dr. King have used to support his argument. With me here in studio is Dr. Jay Smith to help me unpack these examples.
Thank you. Good to be here. Yes, we've been going through all of this material with King versus Gibson. King accusing, Gibson responding. And we're giving him our viewpoint on what Gibson is saying. And we're trying to understand what King is coming up with. And we have been frustrated by King's supposition because it's all based on mathematical models from the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, trying to impose that onto 7th and 8th century difficulties. And you can't do that. You can't assume that the 9th, 10th, and 10th century people knew what the 7th and 8th century people didn't or did not know. And so that's fascinating because we can now see that actually the 7th and 8th century knew quite a bit. They knew more than the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. And if only people would give them a little bit more credit, the 7th and 8th century, the Nabateans, the Arabs from that area, right. If they would only give them a little bit more credit, they would see these people were astounding when it came to direction. They knew exactly how to go. Their life depended on it. Their commerce depended on it. Everything depended on them finding direction. That's why they knew their mosque directions better than anybody else. And by the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, they were now urbanized people with roads, and they didn't need to have they didn't need to go across great swaths of desert without any landscape. So they no longer used the stars. They lost that whole ability to use the stars like the Nabateans were able to do. And that's why they now could not understand how the Nabateans could be so clever.
Right.
And so their view is they just weren't clever. They just were going all over the place. And they didn't know. And they were using solstice lines. They were using equinox lines. They were using the sunsets of the winter, the summer sunsets, which are the solstice line. They were using lines along the sides of Qiblas. Now, what King does is he gives you examples, and he only gives us 6 examples. And I thought it was fascinating. But I want to go through each one of those 6 examples because I think it's good that we understand. So the first one, I won't put it up quite yet, but it's the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. And what he says about this, he says it faces Petra, but it was built on the Byzantine Basilica, which replaced a Roman temple, is what he's saying. That's why it's facing wrong. It's not facing Mecca, it's wrong. Gibson says, no, it's very clear this faces Petra. Very clearly it faces Petra. He said, no, that's not important. It's just the reason why, if it does so, it's because it's built on top of this basilica. The Syrians happily built the mosque facing the Syrian corner of the Kaaba. Gibson's reply is that, and let's look at this now. Let's look at this mosque, and you can see it here. It's very clear that it is in the same area where the temple and the Byzantine church was, but it's also very clear that it faces closest to Petra. And what's fascinating is that it's not that they were putting it just on the foundations of the cathedral. What they were doing is they were just using the rubble from the cathedral. They wanted the place where the cathedral was. That's why they placed it on top.
Right.
But they were more interested in using the space where the cathedral was because it was the center of town, and they were also more interested in using all the rubble.
Now let me show you something. I mean, if you look at it from the top right now, and assuming this is the kind of like a right angle, look at the back wall of this building and look at the front wall inside of this big open space. You'll see that they're not parallel, which confirms what you just said. They're building it on a rebel, but they're making it angled now to face a specific direction.
Yeah.
Not a squared building, technically speaking.
Yeah. And that's why it's important that we do understand what was happening here. But
Right.
Let's go to the second one here. This is the Dome of the Rock, and this one we've already gone on. And when you look at the Dome of the Rock, you will see, let's just put a picture of it up here. Here's a picture of it if you put it up on the slide. And if you can see, it's kind of a little. Sorry, it's not as good as it looks like it's pixelated a bit, but you can see at the top of the screen. There's the Dome of the Rock. Look where the red circle is right next to the right. That is the Dome of the Chain, right next to the Dome of the Rock. And then coming down where the solstice lines are, those are the blue lines. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but towards the bottom of your picture. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was built in 709. The Dome of the Rock, soon after the Dome of the Chain, was built in 691. And the red line that goes from the Dome of the Chain goes directly towards Petra. In fact, the entire citadel is directed towards Petra. And so that's why Gibson is saying that you cannot say, and that's all we need of that one right for now. But you cannot say that this is that this is something that was following what he would say a solstice line, or that it was facing south. Possibly could be Mecca, is what he's saying. No, it's facing directly towards. This is one of those maybe or possibly. It just doesn't make sense. When you look at the degree of error for the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Chain and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, all three in that same citadel, they're 12 degrees off from Mecca. They're only 3.4 degrees off from Petra, which is closer. Petra, obviously.
That's right. And notice that they're next to each other. I mean, that's an interesting
And
part.
it's not even a between mosque, because that's 3.7 degrees. So
That's
it's closer to Petra than the in-between period. And this would make sense because this is before the between. There were no between mosques in 691.
That's right.
They were only begun in 706. So you can see you can't be in between, and that's why it's not between, it's not parallel, it's not Mecca, it's Petra. Categorically Petra. So this idea of it more or less towards the south is not academic, and is not what the kind of response that we should be hearing from someone of Dr. King's potential, and also of his experience, and also his background as the authority in the world on this. Look at number 3 now. This is the Canton Guangzhou Mosque. He says it is oriented at 292 degrees, while Petra is at 295 degrees, and Mecca is at 285 degrees. These are modern degrees. So King says he believes it was directed towards the summer solstice. That's 295 degrees, and it couldn't have been built in 627 anyways, which is before Muhammad had died. So how can you have a mosque built before Muhammad have died? A very good. In fact, that's something that an awful lot of people have brought up, and it's something I'm sure a lot of you are asking. I get this all the time. How can you have mosques that were built while Muhammad was still living? We'll get to that because it's a good question that King brings up. Gibson says that the tradition says it was built by an uncle of Muhammad in 630. It was rebuilt in 1350 and in 1695. But before we get into that, let's just answer this question of how it could have been built. He did say on page 134 of his book, this book here, that the Arabs had contacts with the Chinese all the way from 100 BC. From the 2nd century BC, they have had contact with the Chinese. This was ongoing contact all the way up to 600 AD. Well documented. Everybody knows the Chinese and the Arabs had this kind of contact. So why is he questioning that you could have a building that far away that had Arabs that were actually teaching these people how to do their Qiblas correctly? Right. So that should be eradicated. So there's no doubt that they had contact. But when you look at, there's another book that comes up, and I want to bring his book up, John Hill, who wrote from England, and he wrote a book called Through the Jade Gate to Rome. And in that book, he talks about Chinese explorers who visited the Middle East between 25 and 50 AD. So this is the 1st century. They had come to the Middle East, these Chinese explorers. They found that these Chinese had contact with the Nabateans. Interesting. They purposely came to have contact with the Nabateans. Isn't that interesting that they came with the Nabateans? Why the Nabateans? Because the Nabateans had been in their courts. The Nabateans were the only ones that got that far. The Nabateans were the only ones that made that journey. They were the ones that could make the journey because of the fact of their ability to follow the stars to get that far along. So they had a group of them went to China, where they could easily have explained their use of the stars to that early. What's more, he goes on and says, we are now only hearing about these contacts between the very early Arabs and the Chinese, and this has only come out in the last 10 years. So when King was doing all his work, this was not known. And he was using Bazdawi. Bazdawi would not have known about this contact. He would not have known about this because that contact no longer existed in the 9th and 10th century. But it did exist in the 1st century. And it did exist all the way up to the 7th century. There was this contact with the Chinese. There are over 100 records of exchanges between the Chinese and the Romans, which are recorded as well. So it looks like the Romans had contact with them as well, earlier than that. So it would have been easy for them to have incorporated the Nabatean technology for finding directions using the star. This eradicates that notion. And I just want to show you a picture. Here's a very famous picture, if you put it up there, of the Arabs there in the Chinese courts, where they came with their trade. These are the Nabateans who are coming there, and they're being incorporated into the Chinese. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Let's make sure I get this correct. The Chinese in the Nabatean courts. So here you have the Chinese who are coming back to be in the Nabatean courts. So that's the problem with number 3. Let's go to number 4. And number 4 he brings up is the Sana'a Mosque in Yemen.
And that's the great mosque, basically.
That's the great mosque in Sana'a. We've heard much about it because you're actually doing...
That's right, the Sana'a manuscripts. Yeah.
You're doing the manuscripts from that mosque, which
That's
were
right.
discovered in 1975. And so we'll get into that when we get into the manuscript. King suggests that the major axis of the mosque is parallel to that of the Kaaba in Mecca. The major axis of the mosque is parallel to that in Mecca. That's why it was built in that direction. They wanted it to face the southwestern wall of the Kaaba, not Petra, which they knew nothing about. Gibson's response is, everyone knew about Petra. King says no one knew about Petra by this time. And I have to scratch my head on that one. The Nabateans, Petra, has been around since the 2nd century BC. Are you saying even by the 7th century AD that they knew nothing about Petra? When you stop and look and see.
And people from Yemen would have made journey all the way north.
The Chinese knew about Petra. Everybody knew about Petra. If that's not obvious, then I'm not sure either King's just not aware of it, or he's purposely trying to find something to get around this problem. But Gibson says, so where is there any early literature before these medieval theories which speak of using any walls of the Kaaba for directing early Qiblas? They made it up because they wanted to find a response to it, because they were able to go to the Sana'a and they saw that the mosque, it has the same direction as the Qibla walls in Mecca.
Right.
By the 9th century, Mecca would have had a Qibla wall. Mecca would have existed by the 9th century. It was well ensconced by the mid-8th century. So by that time, they would have known where the Mecca Qibla walls were. But this could not have been something that was in the 6th and 7th century. Would not have existed.
Right.
Even up to the 8th century. Now, here's the other thing, and this is something we brought up earlier, and this is what Gibson brings, and I would explain it as well. If they knew the direction of the Meccan Kaaba wall and were able to parallel their mosques to that direction accurately, then why couldn't they also have directed their Qibla with equal accuracy to the direction of Mecca?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, this is what I noticed with King's argument, Jay, is that he tried to make the early Muslims and the later Muslims to be so sophisticated in the use of technology of their days, the maths, stars, science, and everything in other areas. But when it came to prayer, which is very important for them, somehow they were flawed in their approach. They were very easygoing. They're not concerned about accuracy and so on and so forth. So it's really a slap in the face of early Muslims, actually, the way King is trying to present it.
Yeah. Okay. Mosque number 5, and these are the only 6 he's going to go to. So mosque number 5 is the Cordoba Mosque, and remember the Cordoba Mosque we've talked about earlier, because King always brings up, he loves the Cordoba Mosque. It's in Spain, and he says that it's facing straight south. Now he says, according to his quote, he says he believes that it is because it was built to follow the Roman pattern with the minor axis solstitially aligned between the summer sunrise and the winter sunset, and it was built exactly in accordance with that suburban street plan, and that is why it faces a direction perpendicular to the solstices. Its major axis is parallel to the major axis of the Kaaba. And he uses as his expertise on that a guy named Michael Boning, who has found that these mosques in North Africa follow Roman plans of a city, which follow the cardinal directions. Now, Gibson comes back on that really strong, and Gibson says clearly, if you let's just put up the image of the city itself. There's the image. Take a look. The cardinal lines are in blue, and then take a look and see that the cardinal lines in blue, take a look, there are two different parts of the Roman city. There's a northern part and a southern part. Can you see that both in red? The northern part has larger spaces and the southern part has smaller spaces. Are they parallel?
No.
No. So even the Roman plans are not equal to each other. So what Roman plan, which are you talking about? The earlier ones or the later ones? The earlier ones are the bottom ones, the later ones are the upper ones. Well, you would think they would go with the upper ones, which are the later one. Now let's take the next image. You'll see there's the Cordoba Mosque. It's following the Roman lines of the earlier lines, which are right next to the river.
Right.
But it's following those lines. And if you want to get a mosque that is possibly Roman, you could say this is it, because take a look, it is following those grids of the roads. The difficulty is, what are you going to do with the other 8 mosques that are all from North Africa?
That are different.
They're all following the same lines.
You mean the parallel, basically?
The parallel line. They're all following the exact same line the Cordoba one
they're
is.
different than the other ones
But
on the
none
other
of them
side.
have Roman roads that they're following. So if you're going to make a theory for one, you got to make a theory for all of them, because they're all exactly parallel. They're all exactly looking straight south. So this cannot be used for that reason. And then we'll go to the 6th one, the last one, which he looks at, which is the Wasat Mosque, built between Petra and Mecca in 706. And this is the one where he said, Wasat means what in Arabic?
In between.
Between. So the word itself defines why it was built by Al-Hajjaj.
That's right.
In 706. And then by 1009 to 1155, it was redirected to Mecca, which would make sense. That's the 10th, 11th century. By that time, all the mosques are towards Mecca. But we want to go to this 706 one. Now, King says, it faces the winter sunset, which is parallel with the Meccan Kaaba northeast wall, chosen by early Iraqis, and then redirected later using mathematical equations. He says this was mostly acceptable in those days, but doesn't quote anyone. He just says it. Gibson comes back to him and he says, isn't it odd that they should build a Qibla which was more or less parallel to the northeast wall of the Kaaba, but they couldn't find a Qibla which actually was directed right at the Kaaba? The same problem that he had with the earlier one. Hold on a minute. If you're saying that they could be that accurate from that far away, there in Wasat, way over in the northeast, what is today Iraq, northeast Iraq, are you saying if they could be that accurate to know where the northeast wall was, then they certainly would have known where the Kaaba was?
That's right.
So remember, chapter 2, verse 149 and 150 that you emphasized at the very beginning, it says to do the direction, it.
That's right. I mean, I can tell you that verse alone in the Quran, which I'm not endorsing the Quran, by the way, as divine book at all. All I'm saying, that verse in the Quran refutes King's entire arguments completely, because it's very specific and it's talking about a specific direction towards a specific object. Yeah. And that's all we can say about that.
That's all we can say about it. But we're gonna bring this to a close here. But what I want to do then is look and see what his agenda and what his problems are. Right. Because he gets angry at a lot of people. He doesn't just get angry at Gibson. He gets angry at others that he should not be getting angry at. And so we'll unpack that, because this starts to show probably what King's agenda is. And hey, we may make the list of angry folks as well. So with that says, thank you so much for everybody for watching us, and I hope you've been enjoying this series. And hang tight until we meet again next time. Blessings to you. Thank you for watching. Please like our video, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Syria International. And be sure also to click the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we upload new videos into the channel. And finally, I like to prayerfully encourage you to become a patron through Patreon. Your giving is much needed and will enable us to produce more and more of videos like this so that we can publish them on a weekly basis. So thank you in advance.